Welcome to another episode of Decode. Today I want to play a game with all of you guys. I want to take a myth and I want to confront that myth with science to see how feasible is that myth in scientific terms. I want to build a dragon, but not a science fiction dragon, not a fantasy dragon. No, I want to use real science to understand how would that dragon be? What would it eat? What would be the size? What would be the wingspan? All the different features of the dragon to make it scientifically sound. In fact, this is a video about the power of science to explain natural phenomena. If you think about it, my life has been dominated by two big loves. One of them is the love of science. I am an engineer, I am a scientist, and I love the scientific method. And the other one is the love of mythology. For many years I've worked as a video game designer, so I'm very used at designing monsters and creatures and lore and mythology. And so what I decided to do today is to take one very popular myth, which is dragons, the type of dragons you see in Lord of the Rings or in Game of Thrones or in Harry Potter, and actually put them on the microscope of science to understand really, could a dragon exist? And if it could, how would it look like? What would be the restrictions? Along the way, of course, I'm going to talk about science and about pseudoscience. If we're talking about dragons and we're trying to prove that dragons cannot exist, that's a very valid way to use that as a metaphor of why we know that the Earth cannot be flat, or why we know that chemtrails do not exist, or why we know that vaccines don't cause autism, for example. So again, as we laugh and we have a good time talking about dragons, think about all these other lies that we tell ourselves many times in the modern times. Okay, so let's go ahead. Okay, we're gonna start with a dragon. And again, this dragon needs to live in our planet. Okay, so this is not a fantasy world. This is Earth, and this Earth has the atmosphere and the temperature and the evolution rules of Earth. And so let's put our dragon to the test. The first thing we're going to discuss is to make a believable dragon, of course, it needs to obey the laws of evolution. It needs to come from somewhere. Animals, they don't exist out of the blue, but they come from other animals before them. The same way humans have an ancestor, which is some sort of like an ape, and then that ancestor has previous ancestors in terms of the first mammals, and and so forth and so on. So what we need to understand is what is the thread that connects this dragon to all the other creatures. Because of the look of that dragon, which is called like a flying beast of sorts. Of course, the evolutionary tree, there's not that many to choose from, should be the same evolutionary tree of reptilians and of birds, actually, because reptilians and birds they come from the same stem, so to say, and that's actually fish, opposed to, for example, something like a shrimp, which comes from a different line, which is the same line as spiders and that kind of animals, but all the birds and whatnot and reptilian, they come from fish, the same way as we do come from fish also, and it's interesting if you think about it, because fish, they have fins, and those fins are the predecessors of our legs and our limbs in the case of all the animals, such as, the limbs of a tiger, so to say, for example, or an elephant or whatever, then if you look at fish, they have two pairs of fins, two on the chest, the dorsal fins, and two on the rear, the ventral fins. And that's the reason why, in evolutionary terms, all creatures that are derived from fish actually have four limbs, four extremities. So we have two legs and two arms in our case, or in a quadruped such as a horse, we have four legs. So our dragon should have basically four limbs as well. And so because two of them are actually occupied by the wings, that means that our dragon has two rear legs and two wings. Okay, so we can begin flushing down the toilet all of those dragons that come from a medieval tradition of four legs and two wings. So that would be 6 limbs. And again, there's no creature, and I challenge you guys to look it up. You're not going to find any creature that's actually derived from fish that actually has 6 limbs, because that's in nature, that does not exist. Evolution doesn't work that way. Sure, you can see 6 limbs and 8 and 10 in insects and spiders and that kind of stuff, but not in our thread. So again, our dragon to begin with has 2 rear legs and 2 wings. So if we look at dragons from popular entertainment properties, the dragons from Lord of the Rings are all wrong. So I'm sorry, Smaug, and I'm sorry, the ring wraiths and all that kind of stuff. Your dragons don't exist. They're a lie. Okay. Game of Thrones actually is more recent, and they got it right. If you look at Drogon from Game of Thrones, you'll see that it moves in a really quirky way. But now you see why. It has 2 rear limbs, 2 legs, and then it uses the elbows of the wings as the front feet, so to say, in a way, in order to maneuver on land. There's a reason why, by the way, dragons started having four legs, and the reason was that basically in terms of locomotion, of course, it's much easier because you have a creature that can run really rapidly on land and then fly. But again, that's a biological impossibility. Okay, so again, all the dragons with 4 legs and 2 wings, nope, that's not our dragon. Our biologically correct dragon has 2 rear limbs and 2 wings. Okay. Now let's move on to the second analysis, which is, okay, what is the size of this thing? Again, remember, my challenge today is I'm going to try to make something scientifically correct out of a myth. Okay, so let's look at Drogon, for example, because again, he's the survivor from the previous round, right? The Drogon from Game of Thrones. If you look at Drogon, remember that typically for an animal like this, you would measure the size of the animal by the wingspan, from tip of the wing to tip of the wing. Okay, so if you do some quick analysis of a video of the TV show, you'll see that basically Drogon has a wingspan of about 60 meters, 60 meters from tip of wing to tip of wing. And, with some rough numbers, looking at something of that size, if you look at the body, the central section of Drogon, you compare it with the weight of, for example, like a blue whale or the weight of something like an elephant. I think it would be reasonable to estimate that that's going to weigh about 30 tons. I did some math, of course, before doing this video, some research, and, I can show you all my numbers. But again, my math is basically 60 meters wingspan, 30 tons weight. Okay. Okay, that's not going to fly. Easy as that. That's never, ever going to take off. Let me explain why. If you look at birds and you look at bats, and if you look even at pterodactyls back in the day, they were very lightweight, very lightweight. The energy required to actually take off and sustain flight requires a body that's very, very lightweight. Our dragons are way too chubby. Way too fat. Okay, let me give you some numbers. The biggest pterosaur in history, what's called the Quetzalcoatlus. Okay, that was, of course, in prehistory. Quetzalcoatlus, there's fossils of this animal. It was a beast. The wingspan was between 10 and 12 meters wingspan. Okay, 10 and 12 meters. So it's about 1/6 of a Drogon. Okay, and it's still huge, but it's not as big as Drogon from Game of Thrones. But now let's look at the weight. Again, if Drogon is 60 meters and then weighs something like 30 tons, you would think that basically, something 10 meters would weigh something like 5 tons using the same ratio, right? Nope. That would be impossible because it would be too chubby. A Quetzalcoatlus actually made 12 meters wingspan, and it only weighed 250 kilograms. Which is nothing compared to a dragon. If you look at renders and images of this type of animals, and even modern birds, you can realize that actually their body is very, very small in proportion compared to the body of a dragon, which is extremely thick, extremely big compared to the size of the wings. This is in biomechanics. There's this law called the square cube law. This is very, very easy to understand. Okay, you don't need to know math. But basically, if you look at the wing, a wing is basically like a sheet of paper, right? It's like a plane, And if you want to compute the surface of the wing, it's actually square. It's square. It's kind of like, width times length, So it's x times y. That's a square, right? Whereas if you look at the central body of the dragon, which is the meat of the dragon itself, that's actually more like a box, basically. And if you want to compute the volume of a box and hence the weight of a box, it's actually a cube because it's length times width times height. So when one thing is actually squared, the other thing is cubed. So what I'm trying to say with this is, as you become bigger as a dragon, you become more inefficient because your wingspan is growing in a quadratic way, but your body weight is actually growing in a cubic way. And so what happens is that the same dragon, as it becomes bigger, it's harder for it to sustain flight. You see what I'm trying to say? There's actually people, of course, smarter than me, who have done all this math, scientifics, and biologists, and they have basically reached the conclusion that the heaviest animal that can sustain flight on Earth has to weigh no more than half a ton. So that's 500 kilograms, of weight. Because if it's bigger than that, because of the cube square law, it basically will not be able to sustain flight. So think about this. I've said, Drogon weighs something like maybe 30 tons. And I've said the biggest thing that can fly on Earth weighs half a ton. So we're talking 60 times more. Okay, so our dragon is way too chubby to sustain flight. Then if you wanted it to sustain flight, even with half a ton of weight, the wings would need to become huge, impractically big to be able to hold that thing in the air. Some people have done math that actually how big would the wings of a dragon need to be to actually be able to fly, and they have said it's actually each wing should be the size of a football field. A football field per wing for that thing to be able to take off, and of course that's not the case. And not only that, but there's also the issue of speed. When you want to take off, basically one of the ways to generate lift is to run fast. You've seen this many times. When you take a plane, does it take off when it's going slow? No, it doesn't. It takes off when it's going really, really fast. When it's going 100 or 200 miles an hour, that's when it takes off, right? So the idea is that speed, velocity, actually generates lift. So our dragon, that impractically big dragon, would need to go around 300 kilometers an hour, 200 miles an hour, to be able to take off. Okay, so what you need to imagine is this dragon needs to be either small, that means, again, 500 kilograms or less, or if it's bigger, it would need humongous wings, the size of a football field, and it would need a takeoff speed, which is, even faster than a plane. And remember, a plane has jet engines and a dragon has not. Okay, so in a nutshell, a dragon is physically possible in terms of anatomy, 2 legs, 2 wings, sure. It's not feasible in terms of size. It needs to be very, very, very small compared to your typical movie dragon, so to say. Is there any scientific way to solve this conundrum? This situation of it needs to be either huge or go tremendously fast. Yes, there is a way. And the way to do that is to make a dragon a glider. I know it's much less sexy, but it is what's going to make this work. Gliders are this type of birds who don't take off running, but they take off by jumping from a cliff and just kind of like a delta wing kind of design that just is, using their wingspan to hold themselves in flight, even though they're not going very, very fast. There's several examples of this. For example, one of them is the albatross. The albatross is a glider. If you've seen an albatross ever in nature, they're very chubby, and they're unable to take off on their own. Typically what they do, I've seen albatross in New Zealand, for example, when I was working there, they go to a cliff and they basically jump from the cliff, like if this is called like a jump to death, and then they are able to glide. So forget a dragon flapping its wings the same way you've seen in the movies. That's never going to work. It does not have the muscular force to move those huge wings. It's impossible. What it would need to be is it would need to be very, very small, as I said, something like 10 meters, maybe half a ton at most. Of course, to be so lightweight with that kind of body, you need hollow bones, the type of bones you see in birds. So our bones are actually solid. The bones of birds are actually hollow because a significant contributor to our weight is actually our bone structure or skeleton. Birds have hollow bones, and this dragon would need to have hollow bones. And one more thing, it wouldn't need to be warm-blooded, not cold-blooded as reptilians are. Reptilians basically, they are not able to regulate their own temperature. They are what's called exothermic. We are endothermic. We're able to regulate our own temperature. And reptilians, they need to rest a lot because of that reason, because they consume a lot of energy that way. And we basically were able to regulate our temperature. In order to sustain that huge muscular mass, our dragon would need to be warm-blooded. So again, this is looking less and less like a dragon and more like something else. It's actually looking more like a bird, because the last thing I'm going to recommend is that our dragon should be covered in feathers. Feathers from a biomechanical standpoint are one of the best inventions of nature. Reason being that when you have feathers are very lightweight, and these feathers, what they do is that they increase your wingspan without increasing your weight. That's the reason why birds have feathers, especially on the wings. They have these big feathers that actually they generate surface without adding much to the weight, and that's the reason why that's efficient. So our dragon, in evolutionary terms, most likely at some point Mr. Darwin would have taught the dragon to actually grow feathers, especially in the wings, to make it more suitable for flight. Not only that, I'm sorry I'm breaking all your stereotypes about dragons, but again, that's the way science works. That's the beauty of science, You can begin forgetting also the idea of our dragon being kind of like dark brown or black, which is typically the colors of dragons, There's a mythological reason for that, which is dragons are always related to fire and volcanoes are usually dark color because of the lava and the coal and all that kind of stuff. If you ever go to Hawaii, to Mount Kilauea, for example, you see it, all the black stone on the beaches, and it's really, really, really beautiful. So dragons are typically black. Okay, our dragon has to be white or light color, like beige, like light brown. And there's also a reason for that. The reason for that is basically thermal regulation. For thermal regulation, remember, we're talking about a creature that's able to spit fire. I'm going to talk about that in a second. We're going to answer the famous question is, can you have an animal that actually does spit fire? And the answer is yes, by the way. I think it's complicated, but it could happen. But not if it's dark colored, because if it's dark colored, it would overheat, So basically your dragon most likely would be some sort of like a light color. So again, imagine our dragon is more like a giant vulture than a dragon, something with, again, giant size, sure, not as big as Drogon for by any means, with feathers and with a kind of like that kind of color that you see in vultures and that kind of animals. So now let's move on to the biggie. Can it spit fire? And, funnily enough, when I was researching this video, because of course each one of my videos has research to it, that was one of my surprises, which is, yeah, it could, in a very limited way, but it could theoretically spit fire. Let me tell you how this would work, okay? We do have in nature animals who are able to generate flammable materials. There's one that you know really well, which is you. When we digest food, among other byproducts of our digestion, we have the gas methane. Methane is actually, when we pass gas, that is methane. That's the characteristic smell of methane. So all mammals actually are able to accumulate methane as a byproduct of our digestion. And actually that's interesting, because that's one of the reasons why whenever we see methane on the traces of the gas of an exoplanet, that's one of the reasons why we suspect there could be life there, because typically methane is a byproduct of life, of the composition of organic matter. Okay, so anyway, first, we do have animals such as us able to produce something flammable. Methane is flammable. Okay. Actually, we have animals who do this in a very aggressive way. So, for example, there's this animal called the bombardier beetle. It's not big, but what the bombardier beetle has, it has two deposits on its back, and those deposits basically it's kind of like a combustion chamber. On one deposit, it's holding a chemical product called the hydroquinones, and in the other one, it has hydrogen peroxide. And then when the animal is desperate because it's under attack, he's going to release the contents of the two chambers at the same time. And whenever these two, the hydroquinones and the hydrogen peroxide, combine with each other in the contact of air, they generate an exothermal reaction, a very, very violent exothermal reaction. And then what happens is that actually the outcome of that is a burst coming from the beetle that actually bursts at more than 100 degrees Celsius, not Fahrenheit, Celsius. So, it really kind of like a flaming hot wave of gas. Very small because it's a beetle, but again, it proves us first that we have animals such as us and all mammals able to generate combustion materials. Second, that there's animals who do this as an attack. And of course, the last thing we need is a source of ignition. But because if we have the flammable gas, basically we need the spark, so to say. And do we have animals who generate sparks? Yes, we do. We have this animal. There's several, but the most classic one is the electric eel. The electric eel, as you're well aware, it's able to do electrical shocks in a desperate defensive strategy against enemies. And those electric shocks can actually reach 600 volts of discharge. So again, if you think, of course, in a very loose way, because this is not true science, but again, we're doing a little bit of a speculative science here. You think of an animal that can store methane or any other flammable, and that somehow, for some weird path of evolution, has generated some sort of spark generating mechanism in the mouth or in the throat. Yes, from a theoretical standpoint, that could fly. Well, that could work, not fly, because we've said before it cannot fly. But that could actually generate something that's an animal spitting fire. The question would be, what happens with the mouth? Would it burn himself? No, it wouldn't. And there's two reasons for that. The first one is, as you've seen on sprays, whenever you have a spray and you put fire on a spray, it does not burn the spray itself, because the gas is going in that direction, not in this direction. So the heat radiates in that direction, not in this direction. So that's the first reason. And the second reason is that, yes, we do have animals who have very heat resistant mucus on their bodies. So it's not too far-fetched to think that something could spit some sort of flammable gas, ignite it, and not burn itself. When I was analyzing this for this video, the main constraint we need to impose is that this dragon cannot do this for too long. Okay, maybe for 1 second, maybe 2 seconds at most. So it's not so much like a vomit of fire, like what we see in Game of Thrones, but it's more like a fireball, like a fire burst. And there's a reason for that. The first reason, there's two actually. The first reason is, remember that for combustion we need oxygen, as well as the other things, so we need oxygen and the flammable components. And so, of course, the dragon needs to breathe the oxygen in order to generate the combustion. Okay, so first, we need the oxygen. So that's the reason we need to do bursts. And second, honestly, is that basically, because of the size of a dragon, the storage of this flammable material, it cannot be so big as to do what we see in Game of Thrones of a dragon burning a whole city. It's going to be more kind of like, a very, very short burst. Typically, the way this would work, because of the reasons I just explained, is that for this dragon, most likely this would be a desperate defensive measure, not an offensive measure. Because again, it's just too risky to deplete your reserves of fire just to, for the fun of it. So most likely it would be kind of like a defensive measure, not so much an offensive one. So of course, now we've seen kind of like the budget of the dragon, right? We know the anatomy in terms of, limbs, legs, and wings and stuff. We know the size of the dragon, again, way smaller. We know other features such as feathers, light color, and we know how it generates fire. But what you need to think is that an animal is kind of like a balancing sheet, like an accounting balancing sheet. There's the profit and the loss. And basically, now that we know how much we want to do, there's a cost associated with that. And that cost is metabolism. Metabolism is, okay, how does this dragon generate energy for himself to be able to do all these things? And of course, that energy is generated through food, typically. So how much does this dragon need to eat to be able to do all these things? Okay, of course, dragons do not exist, but let's look at an animal from current times that we can use a little bit like a reference, okay? I'm going to look at one of the biggest birds out there, which is the condor. The condor from the Andes, from, Peru and Ecuador and these countries. The condor is one of the biggest birds out there, 2-meter wingspan. It's a beast. If you've never seen a condor, it's a thing of beauty to see one of those. Okay, so again, as I said, 2-meter wingspan, okay? How heavy is a condor? Typically, an adult condor is 15 kilograms. Okay, so much smaller than our dragon, much smaller. And still, that 15 kilogram condor eats 2,000 calories per day. which is similar to what I eat as a male human. Males, humans, adult humans, we take a diet which is between 2,000 and 2,500 calories per day. So what I'm trying, and I'm 90 kilos, by the way, for reference, okay? So what I'm trying to say is, yes, birds do consume much more energy than we do, because flight is not free. Again, standing on our shoes on the land, it's actually easier than sustaining flight. And of course, birds need to have a much faster metabolism. Some birds, like the colibri from South America, they eat literally every hour because the metabolism is so fast that they need to be eating all day, basically. So if you do a little bit of math and taking the assumption that our dragon weighs 500 kilos, which is, again, as I said before, it's the biggest that he can weight in order to sustain flight, 500 kilograms. If you compare it with the 15 kilograms of our condor, if you do some basic proportions there, you're going to realize that our dragon needs to eat, sit down because this is going to be interesting, a dragon needs to eat 3 million calories per day. Okay, in order to be able to sustain flight, which has a huge weight, and of course the ability to breathe fire, yada, yada, yada. Okay, 3 million calories per day, that requires about 400 kilos of meat every day, So yeah, our dragon, it's barely on the edge of starvation because it needs to be eating all the time to be able to move that huge body and make it fly. In a way, kind of like a dragon is a borderline unsustainable animal, because again, the features of the dragon are incompatible with the rules of basic metabolism, And of course, that should make us think that dragons don't exist. But it's not that they don't exist because I say so. They don't exist because they're incompatible with the rules of science. And science basically tells us what's possible and what is impossible, But there's more reasons why dragons don't exist, and we know as a fact that they don't exist. If dragons did exist, they would have appeared in the moment that it made more sense for them to appear. In other words, let's look at the closest relative of a dragon. Again, as I said before, the giant, pterosaurs of the, prehistoric era. And that's millions of years ago. They had that niche well covered back at the time. So if dragons were viable as an organism, they would have evolved then, not now. Now they don't have an ancestor that they can evolve from in a, let's say, comfortable way. A dragon would have appeared in the time of the pterosaurs, because evolution is not about spectacle. It's not about doing visual effects for, the next Jurassic Park movie. It's about efficiency. It always seeks the shortest path to achieve its goals, So a dragon today doesn't make much sense. A dragon does make sense in the age of the dinosaurs, if it ever did make sense. As we've said before, it does not make sense. And the reason why it does not make sense is a dragon, as the one described in the movies, it's unsustainable because of its size. It could never fly, And even if you made it smaller, let's say we make a dragon, let's say 8 meters, something, like a portable dragon, right? It would never breathe fire, because breathing fire is a very stupid form of defense. Let me explain what I mean by that. At the end of the day, as I said before, evolution favors the easy strategies because they take less effort, of course. Whenever evolution does a random mutation, there's various mutation competing in the ecosystem. And of course, those that are more sustainable, those are the ones that are going to succeed. Okay, let's look at fire breathing. Fire breathing from a metabolic standpoint is extremely expensive, especially if you compare it with other strategies which are way easier. Let me put our dragon side by side with a king cobra, a snake, cobra. A cobra has a different strategy, which is poison. Okay, how much metabolism expenditure or effort does venom require? Very little. So a cobra in a competitive environment is actually way more competitive in the ecosystem than a dragon with its really wacky strategy of breathing fire, which we've said before, it's very, very inefficient. You see? So what happens is that dragon would actually disappear, because in competing with all the other animals, the trade-off of what we have to do in terms of metabolism to actually achieve breathing fire is actually very, very inefficient. And nature does not favor the storytelling or the epic. It favors the efficiency and the sustainability. So our dragon, even if it had ever appeared, it would not last too long because its survival strategy is very inefficient compared with others, other animals of that time, such as, again, snakes, or animals with claws, or any of these things, which are way cheaper in terms of energy consumption and effort required to stay alive, basically. But of course, we do know dragons don't exist. We've known that for 150 years, since the scientific method came about in the 19th century or so. And the reason why dragons were kind of like a thing back in the day, in the medieval ages, there's various theories, but the main theory is actually a composition of two theories. The first one is that, of course, in the medieval ages, when people were doing constructions, a lot of constructions were made from stone, like cathedrals and that kind of stuff, and bridges and yada yada yada. And so whenever they did quarries, to actually extract stone to actually build things, most likely people at that time actually encounter fossils, big fossils. It's not unlikely that they found the fossil of any sort of like big dinosaur. And of course they didn't have an explanation for that, because at that time they hadn't even discovered evolution. And so of course the belief of giant monsters actually is explained by the appearance of fossils in the medieval ages. And then why dragons specifically? That's kind of like a religious kind of thing. We have always been afraid of reptilian kind of thing. That's from the Bible, the snake and Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden, and that's very common across mythologies. In China, for example, there's also the myth of dragons. Even in Latin America, they had the feather serpent, Quetzalcoatl. Actually, the Aztecs were smarter than us, because look at them. They did a feather serpent, A feather serpent is actually easier to fly than a reptilian serpent. So, bravo for my Mexican friends. Their choice was better than ours, But again, there was this thing of, oh yeah, we find giant bones, and, we have this thing of we fear reptilian things. Then, the dragon comes eating the princess and all that kind of stuff. Then comes the 19th century, modern paleontology, evolutionary theory. And then what happens that, of course, we discover that dragons don't exist, that dragons are basically just dinosaur fossils and that kind of stuff, But of course, we know why this became a myth. Again, it was fear of reptilians. It was, giant bones. And of course, fire has always been a source of mythology. Volcanoes and all that kind of stuff has always been kind of like a traditional myth across the world, So to wrap up this video, again, I want to present to you my masterpiece, which is the scientifically correct dragon. So my scientifically correct dragon, let's call him Steve. Steve has 2 legs, 2 wings. So again, lots of medieval dragons, nope, they're gone. Okay. The wingspan of this thing cannot be very, very big, because as we said, it's limited to 500 kilos of weight, even less maybe. So most likely this is going to be, it can be chubby like our dragon, but a wingspan of, let's say, 8 meters, 10 meters tops. So again, much smaller than any of the dragons you've seen in movies. Forget riding that dragon. That's never going to happen. It's too small, Of course, this dragon is very lightweight because it needs to fly, hollow bones, and pale coloration. It needs to be some sort of light brown, kind of like a vulture kind of coloration. That's what would work. And it's feathered, okay, for sure, because making it feathered makes it easier to fly. So at what point do we stop calling this a dragon and we call this a giant bird? That's up to you guys to decide, because what I'm describing is actually a giant bird, not a dragon, feathered and yada, yada, yada. But of course, we all know this modern theory that dinosaurs were actually feathered, some of them at least. And so most likely dinosaurs are more related to birds than we think, or the other way around. Our modern chickens are actually dinosaurs in disguise. It's a glider. It's not a flopping wing kind of thing. It's a glider because of the size and because of the weight. Most likely it lives on cliffs, because that's the way it can take off in an efficient manner without taking too much energy. And the fire, yes, it does exist. It can scientifically be proven that could work, but it has to be as a last line of defense. The same way a bee is able to sting you, but then it dies. For this dragon, the role of fire should be similar to the ink for for squid, for calamari. They use it just when they're desperate, because again, it consumes a lot of energy and they don't have a plan B, because once it's gone, it's gone. So forget any dragon with an offensive source of fire. It would be a defensive source of fire. Typically, a scavenger kind of animal, most likely. The true limits of this is, again, what limits us to create a real dragon like the ones in the movies is the weight to wing ratio. It's just too big, so that makes it too heavy and it will never take off. That's number one. And the second one is, again, the fact of making them not feathered actually makes it very inefficient to fly. The only animals that fly being non-feathered are bats. But if you look at the size of a bat and you look at the size of this dragon, we're talking at a very, very different animal. Bats, most of them weight in the order of grams, not even kilos. So a dragon of this size would need to be feathered for sure for it to fly. But that's the beauty of this video, right? The beauty of this video is that we've taken a myth and we've put this myth under the microscope of science, and we've said yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And of course, in the end, we reach a conclusion, which is the conclusion that a dragon is actually impossible. And that's why we know that dragons don't exist. But again, I could do a video like this, talking about, the flat earth, for example, the flat earth movement, or the young earth creationists, for example, which is, these people who believe really that the Bible is a literal description of the creation of earth. And so they believe that the earth is actually 6,000 years old, which is ludicrous, or the people who believe in chemtrails, or the people who believe vaccines cause autism. And I don't care if that guy works in the US government, it's wrong, because science does not actually support the fact that you're stating in any of those cases, And that's really what this video is all about. As you can imagine, this is not a video about dragons. This is a fun video that I'm recording here. I'm actually in India today. I'm based in Spain, but today I'm in Mumbai, India, because of work. I'm going to be back next week. But actually, I didn't want to actually let my community down by not posting a video today. So it's really funny, because as I was researching this video, I was thinking of the different types of dragons from mythology and science fiction, and which ones were the more sustainable. And as you've seen, any of the flying dragons will not make the cut. Those are not really a good idea. And I was thinking, okay, which one is actually the most believable one? Godzilla, Godzilla from Japanese movies, because as you've seen, Godzilla does not fly, and it's basically a seaborne dragon. And iguanas are well known to be very, very good swimmers. So actually, the kind of behaviors we see in Godzilla swimming, even the way it moves its tail, it resembles a giant iguana. So that's actually more believable than you may think. Okay, this was my video today. I'm Danny. For more than 20 years, I have been working on media, both film, TV, video games mostly. And my passion is science and, and mythology and explaining things. And DECODE is a growing community. It was born from my Spanish channel, which has over 140,000 followers. And this is my English channel, which is now over 3,000 in a month and a half. So I'm very, very, very happy. So if you enjoy my videos, you remember I do 2 videos per week, typically Tuesdays and Fridays. And so please subscribe to the channel so you can be notified for the next time I post a video. And please hit the bell so that you get this notification. And of course, if you like this video and if you comment here below, that's part of the fun, because these things are fun when we talk to each other, So if you thought about this, hey, what other reasons can you think of why a dragon would never survive? Or maybe you think the other way. You think a dragon could actually survive in the wild. So please state your arguments down here below. We're a respectful community that we all like to talk about these kind of things, about the modern world, about media, and about technology. And in this case, about dragons as a metaphor of, scientific progress and knowledge. I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, thank you so much, and see you on the next episode of DECODE.